Three little girls stood in front of their mother's grave, holding a handful of wildflowers they had picked from the side of the road. Their dresses were worn. Their shoes didn't match. Their eyes were too old for their age. Then a black luxury car stopped behind them. A young billionaire stepped out, walked straight to the grave, and whispered, "I miss you, my wife." The triplets froze, because the woman buried there was their mother. And in the next few minutes, those three poor girls would discover a secret that would change their lives forever. If stories about family, sacrifice, and second chances touch your heart, take a moment to subscribe and be part of this journey with us. The sun hadn't risen yet when three small shadows moved quietly through the narrow hallway of a tiny wooden house on the edge of a quiet American town. Bare feet stepped carefully across the creaking floor. "Shoo!" whispered Claire, the first one awake as always. Behind her, Anne and Sophie followed, holding hands so they wouldn't bump into anything in the dark. The kitchen was small, old, and worn, but to them it felt like the heart of the world. "Let's surprise Grandma," Sophie whispered, her voice soft and hopeful. She dragged a small wooden stool to the cabinet. The three girls moved like a team. Claire cracked the eggs carefully into a bowl, and stirred the batter, her tongue pressed between her lips in concentration. Sophie searched the pantry for the last apple and a banana their grandmother had saved. Morning light slowly slipped through the cracked window, touching their small hands as they worked. By the time the sun finally rose, 3 uneven pancakes sat on the table beside a plate of crooked fruit slices and 3 glasses of juice with far too much sugar. Grandma Margaret appeared in the doorway, tying the belt of her faded robe. "What on earth is going on here?" she asked. "Surprise!" the girls shouted together. For a moment, Margaret couldn't speak. Her heart tightened. They were so little, and already trying to take care of her. She should have been the one taking care of them. "Come sit, Grandma," Anne said, pulling her toward the chair they had decorated with a colorful drawing. "It's your special day," Sophie added. Margaret smiled gently. "My special day? It's Mail Day," Claire explained seriously. "And letters are special." Margaret's smile flickered for just a second, because she knew what they meant. Once a month, a thin envelope arrived. Money inside. And the same short message. From their mother. Everyone in the neighborhood believed the story. The girl's mother had gone overseas for work. She sent money when she could. One day, she would come back. That was the story. And for years, Margaret had protected it. That afternoon, the girls played in their small front yard while waiting for the mailman. When his blue bicycle turned the corner, all three ran to the gate. "Mr. Mike, is there a letter today?" The man smiled kindly, already reaching into his bag. "There's one for Mrs. Margaret Green." The girls jumped with excitement. "From Mom!" Sophie shouted. Inside the house, Margaret took the envelope quickly and slipped it into her apron. "Another month," she whispered to herself. "Another secret." That night, after the girls fell asleep, she opened it. The money was less than last month. The note was the same. "Take care of them. I've changed my destination. I can't come back." Margaret placed the cash in an old tea tin above the cabinet. Then she locked the note away with dozens of others, and sat alone on the edge of her bed. Sometimes loving children meant protecting them from the truth, even if that truth was breaking your own heart. The girls' bedroom was small but warm. 3 narrow beds. 3 handmade quilts. And on the wall, drawings of a mother they barely remembered. Every night, the same question came. "Tell us about Mom," Sophie asked as Margaret braided her hair. "She's working very far away," Margaret said softly. "In another country," and added. Claire looked up. "Why doesn't she send pictures?" Margaret swallowed. "Some people don't like photos, sweetheart." Claire wasn't convinced. How will we recognize her when she comes back? Margaret forced a gentle smile. You will. Mothers and daughters always recognize each other. Later, after the girls fell asleep, Margaret wound a small music box their mother had left behind. The soft melody filled the room. The girls smiled in their dreams. And Margaret sat there, rocking slowly, carrying the weight of a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Life wasn't easy. Margaret worked 2 jobs. Night shifts at a diner. Sewing work during the day. The money from the letters helped. But it was never enough. Still, the girls were kind. Grateful. Strong. The kind of children poverty sometimes creates. One afternoon after school, Claire walked in and dropped her backpack on the couch. Grandma, our teacher says we need family photos. Margaret froze. We're making a family tree, and explained. Everyone has to bring pictures, Sophie added. That evening, Margaret climbed into the dusty attic. She searched through old boxes until she found a photo of her daughter, Elise, holding the newborn triplets. But Elise's face looked distant. Already somewhere else. Margaret set it aside. Finally, she found a graduation photo. Elise smiling. Young. Full of hope. Before everything went wrong. That night, the girls glued the photos onto colorful paper. At the top, Mom. Below, 3 girls holding hands. Next to them, a drawing of Grandma. Claire studied it for a long moment. It's missing Dad, she said quietly. Margaret's heart skipped. Some questions were getting harder to answer. And soon, she knew. The truth she had hidden for years would no longer stay buried. And when it came out, it would lead those 3 little girls to a place none of them were ready for. A place where grief, secrets, and a stranger waiting at a grave would change everything. Part 2 continues. That night, Margaret barely slept. The house was quiet, but her mind wasn't. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft breathing of the 3 girls in the next room, and thinking about the phone call she had received earlier that morning. The voice had been formal, distant, careful. There had been an accident. Her daughter, Elise, was gone. For weeks, Margaret had carried the news alone, telling herself the girls were too young, that they still needed their hope. But every day their questions came. Every night they asked about their mother. And every time Margaret answered, the lie grew heavier. By morning, she knew she couldn't keep it hidden anymore. After breakfast that Sunday, she asked the girls to put on their nicest dresses. Are we going somewhere? Sophie asked, her eyes lighting up. Yes, Margaret said gently. We have something important to do today. Claire studied her face. She could always tell when something was wrong. And then Sophie got ready quickly, thinking it might be a picnic, maybe ice cream afterward, maybe something special. But when they were dressed and sitting together on the couch, Margaret didn't reach for her purse. Instead, she sat across from them. Her hands were trembling. You know how I've always told you your mom was working far away? She began. 3 small heads nodded. Margaret took a slow breath. That wasn't the whole truth. The room felt suddenly still. Claire spoke first. She's not working overseas? Margaret shook her head. No, sweetheart. Anne's voice came out small and shaky. Then, where is she? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Your mother left when you were very young. She wasn't ready to be a mom. But she did send money to help take care of you. The girls sat quietly, trying to understand. Sophie leaned forward. But she's coming back someday, right? That was the moment Margaret broke. She reached for their hands. No, honey. She had an accident a few weeks ago. Silence. Then Sophie whispered, Does that mean she died? Margaret nodded, and began crying first. Sophie followed, burying her face against her sister. Claire didn't cry. She just stood up slowly. "You told us she'd come back," she said, her voice tight. "I was trying to protect you," Margaret said. "You lied." The word cut through the room. Then the tears finally came, and Margaret pulled all three girls into her arms. They cried together for a long time, for the mother they had lost twice, once to absence and now forever. That afternoon, they took a taxi across town. The cemetery was quiet and peaceful, nothing like the frightening place the girls had imagined. Tall trees, green grass, rows of simple stones. Margaret carried a small bouquet of white lilies. "Those were her favorite," she said softly. They walked along a narrow path until they stopped at a modest headstone. Elise Green. Birth date. Death date. That was all. The girls stared at the stone. This was the mother they had waited for. The one they had imagined returning. The one they had dreamed about. And now she was here, and knelt first and placed the flowers carefully on the grave. Sophie touched the carved letters. "Hi, Mom," she whispered. "It's me," and added quietly, "We miss you." Claire stood back, her arms crossed, her face tight. "She can't hear us," she said. "She's gone." Margaret didn't correct her. Everyone grieved differently. They stayed for nearly an hour. Margaret shared stories about Elise as a teenager. The way she laughed too loudly. How she loved climbing trees. How she sang in the shower like no one was listening. The girls listened closely, building a picture of someone who had always felt like a stranger. Before leaving, Margaret gave each of them a small porcelain angel. "So you remember she's watching over you." Even Claire slipped hers into her pocket. The ride home was quiet. But for the first time in years, the silence wasn't filled with questions. It was filled with truth. A year passed. Life moved forward the way it always does. The girls grew taller. Their faces lost a little of their baby softness. Claire became even more serious, and spent hours drawing. Sophie still talked to the sky sometimes, whispering messages to her mother. Margaret kept working. Still tired. Still doing everything she could. On the anniversary of Elise's death, she mentioned she planned to visit the cemetery that Sunday. The girls nodded quietly. They didn't say much. But the next afternoon, while Margaret slept after her night shift, the three of them stood in the kitchen whispering. "Now?" Sophie asked. Claire nodded. She picked up a small backpack she had packed earlier. Inside was a drawing they had made together. The three girls, their grandmother, and above them, in the clouds, their mother as an angel. And went outside and picked a handful of yellow daisies from the yard. Sophie tied them together with a ribbon. They left a note on the table. "We went to visit Mom. We'll be back soon." The bus ride across town felt long, but Claire remembered the route. They walked through the cemetery gates alone, holding the drawing and flowers. The place felt bigger without their grandmother. Quieter. More serious. "Do you remember where it is?" and asked. Claire pointed ahead. But as they reached the familiar row of graves, the girls slowed down. Because someone was already there. A young man in an expensive dark suit stood in front of their mother's grave. He held a single white rose. He didn't notice them at first. He just stood there, staring at the stone, like he was trying to understand something that didn't make sense. The girls stopped a few steps away, unsure. "Should we wait?" and whispered. Before Claire could answer, Sophie stepped forward. Her voice echoed softly in the still air. "Excuse me." The man turned, startled. Three identical little girls stood in front of him, holding daisies and a drawing. Sophie looked up at him and asked the question that would change all of their lives. "What are you doing at our mom's grave?" The man blinked, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. For a moment, he just stared at the three girls standing in front of him. The same height, the same eyes, the same quiet strength in their faces. "Our mom's grave," Sophie repeated, clutching the small bundle of daisies to her chest. The man looked slowly from the girls to the headstone, and then back again. His voice came out low, unsteady. "This is my wife's grave." The words hung in the air like something fragile, something that could break if anyone moved too fast. Claire frowned immediately. "That's not possible," she said. "Our mom's name is Elise Green." The man's face lost its color. He turned toward the stone, as if needing to read it again, even though he already knew every letter. Elise Green. His hand tightened around the white rose he was holding. Then he knelt down slowly so he was at their eye level. "You said she was your mother?" "Yes," the three girls answered together. Up close, the resemblance was impossible to ignore. The shape of their eyes, the curve of their cheeks, the way their expressions shifted between caution and curiosity. Pieces of Elise were standing right in front of him. 3 of them. His voice came out quieter this time. "How old are you?" 8, and answered softly. The man swallowed. I didn't know she had children." Claire crossed her arms. "Well, she did." There was no anger in her tone. Just a simple statement of fact. Sophie stepped closer and held out the flowers. "We brought these for her," she said. "Do you want to put them with yours?" The man hesitated only a second before taking the small bouquet. "Yeah," he said gently. "I'd like that." He placed the daisies beside the white rose. The simple wildflowers looked fragile next to the perfect florist arrangement. Poor and rich. Simple and expensive. But somehow, together they looked complete. And reached into her backpack and pulled out the drawing. "We made this for her," she said. The man took it carefully. 3 little girls holding hands. An older woman beside them. And above them, in the clouds, a smiling angel. At the bottom were 3 names written in careful, uneven letters. Claire and Sophie. His throat tightened. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "She would have loved it." Claire placed the drawing at the base of the stone and weighed it down with a small rock. For a few moments, none of them spoke. The air between them felt strange, like they were connected somehow, but didn't understand how yet. Finally, the man stood up. "My name is Thomas," he said. Thomas Blackwood. The name meant nothing to the girls, but the way he said it carried weight. "Did you know our mom?" and asked. Thomas looked down at the grave. "Yes," he said slowly. "I knew her." He paused. "But I guess I didn't know everything." Claire studied him carefully. "You said she was your wife." Thomas nodded. "We were married for 2 years." The girls exchanged confused looks. "Then why didn't she tell you about us?" Claire asked. The question hit him harder than anything else had that morning. "I don't know," he admitted. And for the first time since Elise's death, that answer felt heavier than his grief. Sophie's voice was small when she spoke. "Maybe she was scared." Thomas looked at her. "Maybe," he said, and pointed to the flowers. "Can we stay a little longer?" "Of course," he replied. The girls knelt near the grave and began whispering softly, talking to their mother the way they always did. Thomas stepped back, giving them space. But he didn't leave. He couldn't. He stood there watching them. 3 small lives Elise had carried with her in silence. 3 lives she had never mentioned. 3 lives he had never known existed. After a while, the girls stood and brushed the dirt from their knees. "We have to catch the bus," Claire said. "You came here alone?" Thomas asked, surprised. Claire nodded. "We know the way." Thomas hesitated. Then something inside him shifted. "I'll walk with you," he said. They didn't argue. The four of them walked quietly through the cemetery paths. At the bus stop, the girls sat together on the bench, holding the empty ribbon that had tied the flowers. Thomas stood a few steps away. When the bus arrived, they climbed on without hesitation. Claire turned back once. "Goodbye, Mr. Blackwood." "Goodbye," he replied. The bus doors closed. Thomas watched it pull away. He should have left then. Gone back to his office, his meetings, his life. But instead, when the next car passed, he got in and followed the bus. He stayed several rows behind, out of sight. The girls talked the whole ride. About the drawing. About the strange man. About whether their mother would have liked the flowers. The city outside the window changed slowly. Wide streets became smaller ones. Office buildings turned into old houses. Clean sidewalks gave way to cracked pavement. The bus finally stopped in a modest neighborhood where the houses were small but cared for. The girls got off. Thomas got off too, keeping his distance. They walked down a narrow street and stopped in front of a small blue wooden house with a tiny front yard. Daisies grew near the steps. The same kind they had picked for the grave. The front door opened suddenly. Margaret stepped outside, her face pale with worry. The moment she saw the girls, relief flooded her expression. They ran straight into her arms. Thomas stood across the street, watching. The grandmother held them tightly, checking their faces, their hands, as if making sure they were really there. Then she looked up. For just a second, and her eyes met his. Thomas didn't move. From where he stood, he could see everything. The small house. The worn porch. The three girls pressed against their grandmother like she was their whole world. This was the life Elise had left behind. This was the family she had never spoken about. And for the first time since that morning at the grave, Thomas felt something deeper than shock, something heavier than grief. Responsibility. He stayed there for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his car. But as he drove away, one thought refused to leave his mind. He couldn't pretend he hadn't seen them. And the next morning, Thomas Blackwood would make a decision that none of them were prepared for. That night, Thomas didn't turn on the lights when he walked into his house. The marble floors echoed under his steps, the sound cold and empty, just like every evening since Elise had died. He set his keys down on the long entry table and stood there for a moment, staring into the quiet. This place had always felt big, but now it felt enormous. Too clean, too silent, too empty. He loosened his tie and walked slowly toward the living room. The city lights glowed through the tall windows, but his mind wasn't there. All he could see were three small girls sitting on a bus. Three faces that looked so much like her. "How did you keep this from me?" he whispered into the stillness. He walked upstairs to the bedroom he had shared with Elise. Nothing had been touched. Her perfume bottles still stood on the dresser. Her dresses still hung in the closet. Her books still rested on the nightstand. For months, he had kept everything the same, like she might walk back in someday. But tonight, as he looked around the room, something felt different. Not closer. Not comforting. Just distant. Like he had never really known her at all. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and picked up the framed photo beside him. Elise smiling on their honeymoon. Beautiful. Carefree. But now he saw something else in that smile. Secrets. He set the frame down and walked to the closet. Row after row of expensive clothes. Designer shoes. Jewelry boxes. The Elise he knew had loved luxury. Travel. Fine restaurants. Charity events. How could that same woman have 3 daughters living in a tiny house across town? He opened one of her drawers, searching through papers, documents, anything that might explain. Nothing. No photos. No letters. No mention of the girls. He closed the drawer slowly. 3 daughters, he said under his breath. The words still didn't feel real. Downstairs, he poured himself a glass of whiskey, but even that didn't settle the storm in his chest. He kept seeing the blue house, the worn porch, the way the girls had run into their grandmother's arms. That house had something his didn't. Warmth. Life. He walked into his study and opened his laptop. Elise Green. Search. The results were exactly what he expected. Social events. Charity galas. Photos of the 2 of them together. A polished life. A perfect image. Nothing about the years before him. Nothing about the life she had left behind. Thomas leaned back in his chair, exhausted. He thought about the girls' questions. Did you know our mom? Why didn't she tell you about us? He didn't have answers. But the silence between those questions and his life suddenly felt unbearable. He picked up his phone and stared at it for a long moment. Then he dialed. Robert? It's Thomas. There was a pause on the other end. I know it's late, Thomas said. But I need to talk. 30 minutes later, he was sitting in Robert Henderson's study, the warm light and old books making the room feel lived in. Robert listened quietly as Thomas told him everything. The cemetery. The girls. The house. When he finished, the older man leaned back in his chair. So let me get this straight, Robert said. Your late wife had 3 children she never told you about. And now you're thinking about getting involved in their lives. Thomas nodded. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Robert studied him carefully. How did you feel when you saw them? Thomas didn't hesitate. Like I couldn't walk away. Robert gave a small, knowing nod. Then maybe that's your answer. Thomas frowned. What if I'm just trying to fill the hole she left? Robert smiled gently. Thomas, most people don't do the right thing for pure reasons. Sometimes we act because something inside us hurts. That doesn't make the action wrong. He leaned forward. The real question is this. When you think about those girls, do you feel burdened? Thomas shook his head slowly. No, he said. What do you feel? Thomas looked down at his hands. Like, I matter. The words surprised even him. Robert nodded again. Then you're not filling a hole, he said. You're finding a purpose. They sat in silence for a moment. Finally, Robert asked, What are you thinking of doing? Thomas took a breath. I want to meet their grandmother. Talk to her. Understand their situation. And if she doesn't want your help? Then I'll respect that. Robert smiled. That's the right place to start. The next morning, Thomas drove back to the neighborhood he had followed the night before. His car looked out of place among the older vehicles lining the street. He parked a little distance away and sat behind the wheel for a long moment, watching the small blue house. Children's voices drifted through an open window. Laughter. He stepped out of the car. As he walked toward the gate, he realized something strange. For the first time in months, he was nervous. He knocked. Inside, he heard movement. Footsteps. A chair shifting. The door opened. Margaret stood there, wearing her apron, her expression cautious and sharp. She looked at his suit, his watch, his polished shoes, then at his face. Yes, she said. Thomas swallowed. My name is Thomas Blackwood, he said quietly. I was married to Elise. The silence between them grew heavy. Margaret didn't move. How did you find us? She asked. I followed the girls yesterday, he admitted. From the cemetery. Her eyes hardened instantly. You followed my granddaughters? I know how that sounds, he said quickly. I didn't mean any harm. I needed to understand. She studied him for a long moment. Before she could respond, a small voice called from inside. Grandma? Who is it? The sound of little footsteps came closer. And a second later, 3 familiar faces appeared in the hallway. Sophie's eyes widened first. It's the man from the cemetery. The girls ran toward the door, curiosity stronger than caution. Claire stopped just behind Margaret, studying him carefully, and stepped forward, her voice soft. You came back. Thomas looked at them, then at Margaret again. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said quietly. Margaret hesitated. The girls looked up at her, waiting. The house behind her was small, simple, and full of life. Finally, she stepped aside. Come in, she said. But the way she said it made one thing very clear. He wasn't welcome yet. And whatever happened next would decide whether Thomas Blackwood was about to become part of their lives, or the man they would never open the door to again. Thomas stepped inside slowly, careful with his movements, as if one wrong step might make the entire moment fall apart. The house was small, just as he remembered from across the street. The furniture was worn but clean. The air smelled faintly of laundry soap and something warm cooking earlier that morning. Children's drawings covered the walls. Family pictures. School projects. Crayon hearts. Life. Real life. Margaret closed the door behind him but didn't invite him to sit. The girls gathered nearby, watching him the way children watch someone new, curious, hopeful, but waiting for permission to trust. This won't take long, Thomas said quietly. I just wanted to talk. Margaret crossed her arms. Then talk. Her voice was calm, but the message was clear. Say what you came to say. Thomas nodded. I didn't know Elise had children, he began. I found out at the cemetery, and since then, I haven't been able to stop thinking about them. Margaret's eyes didn't soften. They've managed just fine without anyone thinking about them for years. The words landed hard, but Thomas didn't argue. I'm not here to replace anyone, he said. And I'm not here to take anything away from you. Claire stepped a little closer, listening carefully, and sat quietly on the floor near the coffee table. Sophie leaned against Margaret's side, her fingers wrapped around the fabric of her apron. I just want to understand their situation, Thomas continued. And if there's any way I can help, I'd like to. Margaret gave a small, tired smile. Help, she repeated. It wasn't a warm word coming from her. You're a rich man, Mr. Blackwood, she said. Men like you usually don't come to places like this unless they want something. Thomas didn't rush his answer. I don't want anything, he said, except to do right by something Elise left behind. The room went quiet. For the first time, Margaret really looked at him. Not at his suit. Not at his watch. At his face. At the exhaustion in his eyes. Before she could respond, Sophie spoke. Do you live in a big house? Margaret gave her a warning look, but Thomas smiled gently. Yes, he said. It's pretty big. Bigger than this? Sophie asked. A lot bigger. And looked up. Is it quiet? The question surprised him. Yes, he said softly. Very quiet. And nodded like that answer meant something to her. Claire, still studying him, asked the question that mattered most. Why do you want to help us? Thomas didn't give a quick answer. Because there wasn't a simple one. Because I didn't know about you, he said finally. And now that I do, walking away wouldn't feel right. Margaret pulled out a chair and sat down slowly. Sit, she said. It wasn't an invitation. It was an inspection. Thomas sat across from her at the small kitchen table. The girls settled nearby, listening without pretending they weren't. Margaret folded her hands. "Then you should know the truth," she said. And for the next several minutes, she told him everything. How Elise got pregnant young. How the father disappeared. How 3 babies came at once. How the pressure broke something inside her. She loved them, Margaret said quietly. But love isn't always enough when someone's drowning. Thomas listened without interrupting. "She left," Margaret continued. "Said it was temporary. Said she'd come back when she got her life together." Her voice tightened. "She never did." The girls stayed quiet. They had heard parts of this before, but hearing it spoken out loud still carried weight. "She sent money sometimes," Margaret went on. "Short notes. Nothing personal. Just instructions to take care of them." Thomas's jaw tightened. "And then she met you," Margaret finished. Silence filled the room. "She never told me," Thomas said. Margaret nodded slowly. "I believe you." That surprised him. She leaned back in her chair. "She was ashamed," Margaret said. "Ashamed she couldn't handle being a mother. Ashamed she left. Starting a new life was easier than facing the old one." Thomas looked down at his hands. The life he shared with Elise suddenly felt incomplete, like half a story. "I'm not here to judge her," he said quietly. Margaret studied him again. "Then why are you here?" Before he could answer, Claire walked over with a book in her hands. "Can you read?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. "Yes," he said. She handed it to him. "Grandma usually reads. But she looks tired." Thomas looked at Margaret. She gave a small nod. "Go ahead." He opened the book. The girls gathered around him on the floor. At first his voice felt awkward, unfamiliar in a room like this. But slowly, the tension eased. He changed his tone for the characters, added little expressions. Sophie giggled, and leaned against the couch, listening quietly. Claire didn't laugh, but she didn't look away either. Margaret stood by the sink, pretending to rinse a clean cup, but her eyes stayed on them. When the story ended, Sophie clapped. Again. Thomas laughed. "Maybe next time." The word slipped out naturally. Next time. Margaret noticed it. He stood to leave a few minutes later. "Thank you for letting me come," he said. Margaret walked him to the door. Outside, he hesitated. "I meant what I said," he told her. "I don't want to take over your life. I just want to help if you'll let me." Margaret looked back through the window. The girls were already sitting together, flipping through the book again. "They've had people leave before," she said quietly. "They don't need another one." "I won't," Thomas replied. She studied him carefully. "Words are easy," she said. "Consistency isn't." Thomas nodded. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said. Margaret didn't answer. But she didn't close the door right away either. That evening, the girls talked about him non-stop. "Do you think he'll really come back?" Sophie asked. Claire didn't answer immediately. She looked toward the window. "We'll see," she said. And the next morning, a black car pulled up outside the small blue house again. But this time, it didn't come empty-handed. The sound of the car door closing carried down the quiet street before anyone inside the house noticed. Margaret was at the kitchen sink when Sophie ran to the window. "He's back." There was excitement in her voice, the kind children try to hide but never really can. Claire joined her, more controlled, her eyes sharp and observant, and stayed near the table, twisting the edge of her sleeve. Outside, Thomas walked toward the gate, holding a plain brown paper bag in one hand and a small toolbox in the other. Nothing expensive. Nothing flashy. Just simple things. Margaret dried her hands slowly. "Let him in," she said. The girls didn't wait to be told twice. By the time Thomas reached the porch, the door was already open. "Good morning," he said carefully. "Morning," Margaret replied, stepping aside. He walked in and placed the bag on the kitchen table. "I stopped by a supply store," he said. "And the grocery on the way." Claire looked inside the bag. Fresh fruit, bread, milk. Simple things, but better quality than what they usually bought. Sophie's eyes lit up. "Strawberries." Margaret's expression tightened slightly. "We don't need charity," she said. Thomas shook his head. "It's not charity," he answered calmly. "It's groceries. I figured if I'm coming by, I shouldn't come empty-handed." She studied him for a moment. Then she nodded once. "Thank you." That was the first time she had said it without hesitation. Thomas set the toolbox down near the sink. "I noticed the faucet was leaking yesterday." Before Margaret could protest, he was already rolling up his sleeves. Within minutes, the sound of tools and running water filled the kitchen. The girls gathered around like it was a show. "Do you fix everything?" Sophie asked. Thomas smiled. "Not everything. But I try." Claire leaned closer, watching carefully, and sat nearby with a piece of paper and a pencil, sketching the scene quietly. By the time the leak was fixed, something in the room felt different. Less formal. Less guarded. Thomas wiped his hands and stood. "I've got a meeting this afternoon," he said. "But I can stop by again tomorrow." Margaret crossed her arms. "You don't have to come every day." "I know," he said. "But I want to." He looked at the girls. "Is that okay with you?" Sophie nodded immediately, and gave a shy smile. Claire hesitated, then said, "If you're coming, you should bring another book." Thomas laughed softly. "Deal." The next few days, he kept his word. No big gifts. No expensive surprises. Just presents. One afternoon he brought coloring supplies. Another day, a small puzzle. Sometimes he fixed things around the house. A loose step. A broken cabinet hinge. A light that had been out for months. Margaret watched all of it carefully. She didn't relax. Not yet. But she also didn't stop him. One Saturday, he showed up with a picnic basket. "I thought we could go to the park," he said. Margaret hesitated. Then she grabbed her sweater. "I'm coming too." The park was only 10 minutes away, but for the girls it felt like an outing to another world. Fresh sandwiches. Juice boxes. A blanket spread under a tree. They laughed. They ran. They played hide and seek. For the first time since Elisa's death, Thomas heard himself laughing without forcing it. While the girls played nearby, Margaret sat beside him on the bench. "You're getting attached," she said quietly. Thomas didn't deny it. "Yes." She looked at him carefully. "And if one day you decide you're done?" "I won't." She shook her head slightly. "Everyone says that at the beginning." Thomas watched the girls running across the grass. "I know I'm not their father," he said. "And I'm not trying to replace anyone." Margaret stayed silent. "But they matter to me," he continued. "And I'm not walking away from people who matter." She didn't respond, but her shoulders relaxed just a little. Over the following weeks, his visits became routine. The girls began waiting for his car. Sophie would run outside the moment she heard the engine, and would bring her drawings to show him. Claire would have questions ready. Real questions. About business. About the city. About how someone becomes successful. At night, when Thomas returned to his large, quiet house, the silence felt heavier than before. because now he knew what noise felt like. Laughter. Arguments over crayons. 3 voices talking at once. One evening, sitting alone in his study, he opened his phone and began recording. "Once upon a time," he said, feeling slightly ridiculous, "there were 3 sisters who lived in a little blue house." The next day, he handed his phone to Margaret. "I thought maybe they'd like a bedtime story," he said. That night, the girls listened under their blankets, smiling as they recognized his voice. "Another one tomorrow?" Sophie asked. And just like that, a new routine was born. Every evening, Thomas recorded a story. Not about princesses or castles, but about courage, about kindness, about not giving up. Margaret noticed something else changing too. He wasn't just helping anymore. He was staying. One rainy afternoon, he arrived soaked after running from his car. Margaret handed him a towel without thinking. Then a cup of hot chocolate. "Thank you," he said, surprised. She gave a small smile. "You're family now," she said quietly. The words hung in the air. Family. Thomas didn't answer right away, but something in his chest shifted. Later that night, after he left, Margaret sat alone in the living room. The girls were asleep. The house was quiet. She picked up an old photo of Elise holding the newborn triplets. "I couldn't keep you," she whispered to the picture. Her voice trembled. "I won't lose them too." Because even as trust was growing, a new fear had begun to settle in her heart. What if one day Thomas Blackwood decided that visiting wasn't enough? And what if the girls decided they wanted his world instead of hers? The fear stayed with Margaret for days. She watched the way the girls ran to the door when Thomas arrived, the way their eyes lit up when they heard his car, the way they talked about him at dinner, at bedtime, even in their sleep. "Tommy said I'm good at math," Claire mentioned one evening. "He's bringing a book about birds tomorrow," and added, "He promised to teach me how to plant strawberries," Sophie said proudly. Margaret smiled every time, but inside something tightened, because love had already taken her daughter away once, and now love was bringing someone new into their lives. One Sunday afternoon, while the girls played in the yard, Margaret finally spoke. Thomas was fixing a loose board on the porch when she stepped outside. "Can we talk?" He set the hammer down immediately. They sat on the wooden steps, watching the girls chase each other across the grass. Margaret didn't look at him when she spoke. "You've done more for them than anyone ever has." Thomas stayed quiet. "But I need to ask you something honestly," she continued. "What do you really want from them, from us?" Thomas took a breath. "I want to be part of their lives," he said simply. Margaret nodded slowly. "And if one day you decide you want more than visits?" He turned to her, confused. "What do you mean?" Her voice was softer now. "You're a wealthy man. You have resources, connections, opportunities one could never give them. What if one day you decide they should live with you?" Thomas stared at her. "You think I'd try to take them from you?" Margaret's eyes filled with quiet fear. "I think the world you live in could give them things I never can." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Thomas looked out at the girls. Sophie had fallen and was laughing, and was helping her up. Claire was already brushing the grass off both of them. "They already have what matters," he said quietly. Margaret looked at him. "They have someone who never left," he continued. "Someone who raised them when it was hard. Someone who chose them every single day." His voice softened. "I'm not here to replace you. I'm here because there's room to love them, not because I want to take them away from the person who loves them most." Margaret's shoulders shook as she tried to hold back her tears. "I was afraid," she admitted. I already lost my daughter. I couldn't survive losing them too. Thomas reached over gently and placed his hand over hers. You won't, he said. Then he added, with quiet certainty, we're not building a new family to replace the old one. We're building a bigger one so no one ever feels abandoned again. That night, Margaret slept peacefully for the first time in months. From that day forward, something changed. The tension faded. The worry eased. And trust finally took its place. Weeks later, on the anniversary of Elisa's birthday, the 5 of them went to the cemetery together. The girls carried fresh flowers and brought a drawing. Claire carried a small notebook. Sophie held Thomas's hand. They stood quietly in front of the headstone. After placing the flowers, Claire opened the notebook. We wrote something, she said. The girls stood side by side and read together. Dear Mom, we missed you for a long time. We were angry too. But Grandma told us you were scared and hurting. We understand now. We're okay. We're not alone anymore. Anne's voice trembled. We forgive you. Sophie finished softly. And we think you'd like Tommy. Margaret wiped her eyes. Thomas couldn't speak at all. For a moment, the wind moved gently through the trees, and the sunlight warmed the stone. It didn't feel like a place of loss anymore. It felt like a place of peace. On the way back to the car, Sophie looked up at Thomas. Are you staying forever? He knelt down so he was eye level with all 3 girls. Yes, he said. And this time there was no doubt in his voice. Months passed. The house was repaired. The girls started attending a better school, but they still came home to the same dinner table, the same routines, the same grandmother waiting for them. Thomas never tried to change who they were. He didn't replace their world. He became part of it. He showed up for school events, helped with homework, fixed things, listened, stayed. And slowly, the empty rooms of his own house began to fill with drawings, laughter, and weekend sleepovers. One evening, as they all sat together watching the sunset from the porch, Margaret looked at him and said quietly, You know, Elise didn't leave them with nothing. Thomas glanced at her. She left them the chance to be loved twice. He looked at the 3 girls sitting on the steps, arguing over whose turn it was to choose the movie. And for the first time since Elisa's death, the guilt he had carried began to fade. Because love hadn't been lost. It had simply found another way home. In the end, it wasn't wealth that changed their lives. It wasn't the big house. It wasn't the money. It was something much simpler. Someone who stayed. Someone who chose them. Someone who proved that family isn't built by blood, or by status, or by what you own. Family is built by the people who show up and never walk away. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe. And tell us in the comments, which part of the world are you watching from?